We tend to think of emigrants as travelling to North America or Australia in steerage, in crowded, cramped, huddled conditions. We think of them as the poor, of the dispossessed. And yet, on many emigrant ships, there were a large number of middle-class people travelling. One of these was 18 years old Joseph Sams from St Pancras, London, travelling from London to Melbourne in 1874 on the Northumberland. Sams was the son of the landlord of the Blue Posts public house in St Pancras. He was going to Australia to seek his fortune. And you might have thought that in doing so, they would be leaving some of the petty snobberies and class distinctions of the old world behind them. Not at all. Snobbery and class distinction prevailed on board ship. Indeed, you could say that the ship was a microcosm of the world they had left behind. Sams was a clerk. He was travelling in second class. His fellow passengers were, with a few exceptions, all in the middle class of life. They included farmers, bakers, merchants, innkeepers, miners, gentlemen and their wives. And he considered the majority of them to be more or less agreeable. His views of those travelling in steerage were a lot less complimentary. He just dismissed them as being an ill-assorted lot and awfully dirty common wretches. He was especially dismissive of the Germans travelling, some of whom have between 1,000 and 2,000 canaries on board. They were, on the whole, a rough-looking lot. The comment about canaries, interestingly enough, is echoed in many other contemporary descriptions of emigrant ships. For some reason, German passengers, German emigrants, liked canaries. Well, Sams was no less dismissive of the more upper-class passengers who were travelling in saloon class. He was just as snobbish about them. And he did resent the fact that many of them were slumming it and going to observe what was happening in second class and steerage. One woman from the saloon would go and conduct religious services, and Sams considered that to be humbug. He didn't bother with them. Meanwhile, he noted that some people were visiting the other classes for perhaps less salubrious and moral reasons. One of his fellow passengers in second class, travelling on the Northumberland in 1874, was in the habit of going into the third cabin to court a woman there. On one of these romantic visits, the two lovers had flowers thrown at them. Well, they complained about it to the mate, but as Sam said, Of course, he can do nothing, as they have no jurisdiction in rows between the classes. Well, Sams was very critical of the dress code of many of the saloon passengers. He said, "Some from a distance seem very seedy, but that matters not. They are there, so I suppose can dress how they like." Detect a touch of envy there? Well, one reason that people weren't dressing well and were wearing perhaps their oldest clothes was that very soon on board ship, their clothing became infested by vermin and pests. It could also get damaged by sea spray, so they dressed just for comfort and in their shabbiest. Also, as the weather got hotter, then they tended to wear less and dress less formally. Sams himself relaxed from the middle-class dress codes to a considerable extent. In the warmer weather, he was going about with shirt all undone, showing my noble, never mind. One morning he appeared at breakfast in rowing attire, flannel trousers and gauze vest, no sleeves. This was to offend one of his fellow lady passengers. His less than gallant response was to tell her to go and sit somewhere else. He was also very envious of the luxury and good food that the first-class passengers enjoyed. In his view, the first class live like fighting cocks, and it is rather galling to see all the pastry and the good things being taken under your very nose from the galley to the chief's saloon. Well, Sams found the distraction from the 2-month voyage was heavy drinking and eating. Of course, this led to boozish overindulgence. For cabin passengers, there would be fresh milk, cream, eggs, and meat provided by cows, goats, sheep, pigs, ducks, geese, and chickens, kept in special pens on deck. The forecastle of the Northumberland was just like a young farmyard. But sadly, these luxuries were not for everyone. And many of the passengers, better off emigrants as well as the poorer ones, were trying to escape their own demons. For anyone who had a problem with alcohol, the ship was not the place to be. It merely exposed the alcoholic trying to ward off the demon drink to further temptation. One of the fellow passengers that Sams became friends with was a fellow heavy drinker. Both of them preferred drinking port to attending a church service. And whilst this service, conducted by a lady from the first-class saloon, was taking place, they would sit there with their bottle of port at one table, while at the next, other passengers were praying. For Sams, it was rather amusing to see some of the fellows making believe to be religious, and all the time laughing. Indeed, so much that one of them, whilst singing a hymn, went dry. So he went into his cabin, applied a bottle to his lips, and then with renewed vigour returned and attacked the hymn. Sam's new friend, Charlie Woolens, had been a great drinker and profligate, owing to the fault of having none to guide him. He was going out to Australia to try to break himself from the habit of drinking. Well, Joseph Sams was not the best person to do that, or to take him in hand. Sams himself was to injure his hand when the neck of a bottle he was uncorking broke, and he was obliged to get Charlie to help me wash on account of finger. He was also forced to have his breakfast cut up for him, as he was as helpless with my left hand as a baby, which goes against the grain. Remember, he was the son of a pub landlord, and indeed he was to organise heavy and boisterous drinking sessions with his fellow passengers. He prided himself that when his drinking companions retired to their cabins to lay down regular slood, he, your humble servant, was all right. He noted that one of his fellow drinkers sat with his eyes dilated, mouth wide open, and as still as possible for about 1.5 minutes, and then he jabbers. The alcohol at last escaped through his nose, much to our amusement and his discomfiture. Sams was also to impress fellow passengers by a practical joke played on a drunken member of the crew. After his failure to get into some of the girls' cabins in third class, but under threat of giving it up, this crew member had entered the cabin of a married woman and her husband, and in Sam's words, he wanted to take liberties with the wife. Well, on this occasion, the drunken storekeeper had got off with a hot caution from the captain. But on the previous day, Sams had found this very same man naked and drunk in his berth, and had poured the best part of a bottle of blue ink over him, much to the amusement of the middies and the passengers. It was not the most refined of environments, even for the middle classes and first-class passengers. But it helped to while the voyage away. After 2 months on the Northumberland, Sams and his fellow passengers on the 16th of November 1874 rose early on the day so they could catch their first sight of their new home. They were coming close to Melbourne. Sam said that the sun rising this morning was most magnificent, and nothing has prevented a more beautiful sight than it has done this morning. While the passengers packed up their clothing and other possessions, the ship approached the quarantine ground in a fine open bay. The medical officer from Melbourne came on board, stayed for about 10 minutes, and then we were allowed to go on with a free pass. The Northumberland then continued onto the Sandridge Pier, and Sams then wished the ship a goodbye as far as inhabiting her went, and entered the great and prosperous city of Melbourne. This is where his diary ends. We know no more about his future in Australia. how successful he was, whether he was able to overcome some of his foolish and snobbish attitudes. But certainly, that diary does give us an insight into what it was like to travel as a middle-class passenger on an emigrant ship.